second week of Lent, the second week in our worship series, Running on Empty. A recent news story has touched a lot of us. The story of Kyla Mueller, a 26-year-old aid worker in Syria, who was imprisoned and eventually killed by ISIS. Jacob likes to help with the sermon. This story struck something deep in me, even before I learned that one of my good friends was very good friends with her. Many of you have read the beautiful letter that she wrote from prison, where she says, "By God and your prayers I have felt cradled in free fall. I have been shown in darkness light and have learned that even in prison one can be free." You've no doubt heard the phrase, freedom from suffering. Many religions see this as the goal, heaven or nirvana, the place where suffering ceases to exist. But today we're talking about something a little different, something counterintuitive, freedom through suffering. During Lent, as we move toward Holy Week and toward encountering again the very difficult story and history of Jesus' suffering, we have to ask ourselves, what does it mean to emulate our lives after a rabbi, a teacher, who willingly took up his cross? What does it look like to follow the way of a suffering servant leader? And what is it about the one we follow that has empowered people like Kyla to enter experiences of suffering and find freedom? One of the experiences that Presbyterian and UCC pastors are required to go through in order to be prepared for ministry is a clinical pastoral education internship in a hospital. CPE, they call it. And for many, CPE is very difficult because in caring for others who are in crisis, a lot of our own personal baggage comes up. You have to face down all of the demons of your past and current crises in order to be able to help the people that you're called to care for. And so part of the internship involves essentially group therapy and group reflection. During one of our times, one of the chaplain fellows at the hospital, a Buddhist woman, gave all of us interns a piece of advice that I will never forget. She said, lean into the tough things. It's so counterintuitive, really. Usually we want to pull away from or run away from or defend ourselves against what is tough. She said, lean into it. If someone says something harsh or accuses you of something, lean in. Ask them more questions. Try to love them through it. If something brings up pain or sadness for you, lean into that place inside of yourself. And even though her advice came from the perspective of the Buddhist tradition, as I began to practice it, I realized I was learning how to more fully follow after Jesus, because he had the same counterintuitive understanding of suffering. It works a little bit like this. All of you got these Chinese finger traps when you came in today. Go ahead and put your fingers way deep inside it. Stick them in either side. Now the way these work is you pull as hard as you want, it just gets tighter. You get trapped more. Right? The way to get it off, and I'm sure you're all wondering that. It's important. So you have to lean in. You have to push in both sides to the other. And it comes off. Is it working for you? Hopefully not. You are permanently so. know that Jesus possessed this kind of wisdom about suffering because he willingly leaned into painful and risky experiences that others avoided. And he willingly leaned toward people who were out to get him often. In our passage today, Jesus tells the disciples and the crowd gathered around him that the Son of Man, which was a name used by the ancient prophets, which Jesus claims as his own, that the Son of Man will suffer greatly and die, and 3 days later will be raised. Peter, the disciple in whom we see so much humanness and so much of ourselves, has a visceral reaction to this. Just a few verses before, he has told Jesus that he thinks he's the Messiah. Peter thinks that he's signed on, enlisted, to achieve victory, freedom from suffering. The crowd, no doubt, has a visceral reaction as well. In 6 CE, not long before, they had watched the Romans crucify 2,000 Galilean insurrectionists. They had watched their fellow countrymen experience excruciating torture. That marks a person. And that is certainly what they wanted to be freed from. To hear this leader, on whom they had picked so many of their hopes, tell them that he would meet the same fate as these insurrectionists, it must have been extremely disheartening. And I bet you that most of them completely missed that little part about raising 3 days later. Certainly Peter seems to, because you can almost see Peter grabbing Jesus' arm and spinning him around away from the crowd and saying, "What are you saying? Be careful what you say." Jesus had told Peter not to go around telling anyone that he thought Jesus was the Messiah. But now Jesus thinks it's okay to tell everyone that he's going to suffer and even die? Surely that's not going to rally the troops the way Peter wants to see them rallied. But Jesus understands something about love and suffering and about kings and power. A couple months ago, I noticed that there was a show out called Reign about Mary, Queen of Scots. I had studied that period of church history quite a bit in college and grad school, and so I was intrigued and I watched a few episodes. The show is largely marketed toward teenagers, and I imagine it probably sticks, or does not stick very closely at all to the actual historical people. But I thought it did a really fantastic job of depicting how even rulers with incredible power and wealth can become so entrapped. When Mary's husband, Francis, ascends the throne in France, she and Francis decide that they want to be different kinds of rulers from his parents. They don't want to rule by fear. They want to be respected as kind, fair, benevolent rulers. Mary even goes so far as to say she doesn't want anyone to die for her. But quickly people begin to blackmail them with threats to take away their power, threatening the people they love. And they begin to make a string of decisions, choosing to sacrifice the life and well-being of a huge number of people to save their own. They end up essentially backed into a corner, unable to love or care for the people of their kingdom the way they want to. Now I know our lives may not be as dramatic or as politically scheming as 16th century royalty, but But I think we can often end up living life as backed into a corner by fears or self-interest or self-protection, self-preservation. We can have the best intentions of loving others unconditionally, of caring for them, but our self-interest or our self-preservation can get in the way. We get worried or anxious about the implications it will have for us or those we love. Nelson Mandela, during his many years in prison during the South African apartheid, wrote, "For to be free is not merely to cast off one's chains, but to live in a way that respects and enhances the freedom of others." I think that's the kind of freedom Jesus understood. Some religions advocate that attachment is the root of suffering. We get too attached to things and people and stuff. And when we lose it, that's what causes suffering, then, because we were attached to it. Jesus, to some extent, says this too. But the one thing that Jesus does not advocate detaching from is relationships. Jesus clings to those bonds of love between himself and the Creator and the Spirit, and through that relationship clings to love for all of his fellow humanity. And rather than detaching from those relationships, he leans into them. He follows love even into incredible suffering and death, because he realizes that freedom is not merely freedom from suffering, but freedom to love. And he realizes that that kind of freedom, freedom to love, oftentimes involves suffering, or can lead us there. Yesterday, a number of us attended the Presbytery meeting, as many of you know. Presbyterian Church USA is one of our denominations. And yesterday, the Presbytery was voting on an amendment about whether to include a change in the Book of Order that would basically be inclusive in its marriage definition of gay and lesbian couples. And I'm very happy to report that it passed. 189. There was a lot of debate before the vote. And from what I'm told, the dialogue was much more civil and respectful than it has been in years past. The Presbyterian Church has been voting on this since 1978. But it still wasn't a particularly pleasant experience to sit and listen to the other side share opinions that were hurtful and sometimes offensive. As I stood up to speak on the Presbytery floor, I was shaking with nerves. But I also was thinking about all the brave men and women who have stood up to speak years before me, when it was a much more hostile environment, and when there was often a far greater personal cost. I was thinking of people like Harold Brockes, who was a pastor here for 30 years, a straight supporter and an advocate who many years was one of the only people on his side of the aisle at the Presbytery meeting. It's because of the courage of people like him who leaned into suffering that we are where we are today, 37 years after the Presbytery started voting on this. A bit later in the meeting, a candidate for ordination, a man who began his career as a doctor in psychology, stood up to be examined by the presbytery. That's the tradition when someone's being ordained. And one of the questions that was asked of him was if he had ever found a really He responded, "The greatest impediment to listening in the midst of conflict is anxiety." He said we won't heed what is said if we are anxious about the outcome. And I think we could extend that further to say we won't do what is necessary out of love if we are worried about the outcome for ourselves. We know that Jesus wasn't detached from pain and suffering. We know that he was human and anxious, just like we are. We know that facing suffering, he pleaded with God for another way. But we also know that on the night of his arrest, he found a way to give up his anxiety and turn instead to a place of calm trust in God. That God could bring about good out of any outcome, even death. We're moving this season of Lent toward a remarkable good news. We spend the season getting ready for it. It's a good news where we will witness in Jesus a shattering of anxiety about outcomes. Where we will hear the message that God has the last word. That we are free to love, even to suffer for love. That, I believe, is what gives Kyla Mueller the ability to find freedom, even in the midst of suffering. There was a side story to the main news story about her boyfriend, who apparently was arrested with her at the same time, and he was tortured and questioned, but eventually released. And he went back to try to free her. She may or may not have known that he was coming back to free her. She may or may not have known whether he was being imprisoned again or what the situation was. But they told her that if she told the truth, they would let him go. And so when they asked her if she was married to him, she said no. It may have saved her life. But she was able to lean into love because she was tapping into some kind of power. Some kind of internal power and trust that God would carry her and that the outcome was in God's hands. Freedom through suffering. God be with us as we learn how to practice this in our lives.